And generally this is the most important thing to consider when choosing sounds, and that's one thing you want to consider with these types of beats because he does it a lot. Also, this is something I see a lot of producers do that can just ruin the entire beat. Finally, the last effect is probably the one that he uses the most. Alright, what's good YouTube? So in this tutorial, I'm going to be going over how Nav makes his signature melodies, specifically a type of old stuff that he used to make like Perfect Timing as well as his debut album. Specifically, I'm going to be going over his favorite VSTs, scales, his favorite drum kits and drum patterns, how he makes his melodies, his go-to plugins and effects, as well as various tips and tricks along the way. Also, if you want any of the drum sounds or samples that I use in this tutorial, there's a link in the description where you can download them completely free. Also, make sure to follow my Instagram and Twitter at FinnaFinesse to keep up with what I'm doing as well as participate in like votes for what videos I do next. Also, because I do giveaways, which speaking of, tonight is probably the last time I'm going to be giving away my drum kit, but I'm also working on a loop kit, so I'll have other things to give away as well as sponsorships with other companies, so I'm going to be giving away VSTs sometime, so make sure to go follow that. Yeah, but that being said, let's talk about Nav. So right off the bat, you want to set your tempo range somewhere between like 150 to 180 BPM. Sure, he doesn't always use these tempos, but back when he was producing his own stuff, most of his well-known songs like Call Me, Myself, On My Own, Fell in Love, and Some Way, they all kind of sat in this tempo range, so that's what you want to go for. So let's talk about VSTs. There's 4 main VSTs I'd recommend using whether it comes to Nav beats. They're Serum, Nexus 2, Omnisphere, and Electra X. Honestly, all the stuff you hear in like Nav tracks most likely comes from Omnisphere, because personally I found a crazy amount of presets in there, but you can find equally good presets in any of these VSTs in my opinion. And that being said, if you don't have Omnisphere, I'd say try using Nexus 2 because that's also his like second most used VST. And also if you don't have that, I'd say use Electra X. Serum is more like for bass sounds, as I'm going to talk about. And if you have all these VSTs, I'd say use Electra X for bells and key sounds, use Omnisphere for everything, use Nexus 2 for keys, bells, pads, and the bass sounds, use Serum for keys and bass sounds. But at the end of the day, if you're really good with effects, specifically stuff like reverbs and delays, you can use just about any synth preset that you like. And generally this is the most important thing to consider when choosing sounds, so it doesn't have to be consistent. The one thing that does though is that you want to avoid using like sharp frequencies. So stuff like sine presets you hear in a lot of his beats because they're really soft to the ear. You know, you don't want like super sharp stuff like saws and whatnot. So the best way to find these is quite literally going into the retro bells as well as ambient bells section in Omnisphere. Or what you can do is this trick that I talked about in the Metro tutorial, where you can take a preset that has effects that you like, go into layers and change the actual sound being used in the preset. Specifically when doing this, you want to browse in the synthesizer section. And if you want to find more experimental sounds, here's a little trick that you can do. Whenever you use a preset that has a synth listed at the front of the preset's name, try searching Omnisphere libraries using that synth name. So for example, I have this preset that's called like JX03 soft sines. So what I would do if I was trying to find presets like this, what I'd do is I just search JX03, and as you'll see, a bunch of other presets that also sound like what you're going for will come up, and it'll give you more experimental sounds because it's super analog stuff that's been like sound designed by individual people, so it's not like the typical like sine presets that you hear. As for actually making the melody, you want to go for like those sad boy vibes, so a lot of like 2-note gaps. Some of the common scales that you hear in his beats are like C minor, A minor, F minor, and D sharp minor, as well as C sharp minor. But F minor I found was the most common one, so I guess you can just start with that. Generally the main elements of his beats are just like chords with simple leads that sit on top of them. He keeps it super basic, like there's nothing complex going on here like music theory wise. Also, these aren't your typical 3-note chord progressions like I talked about in the last tutorial. Just keep it basic, but then just add notes on top of your melody to give it more voices, as well as various notes in between to make it more interesting. And here's the thing to consider, a lot of the times with these types of beats, people just have their chords stretch out like this, but not all the times key presets that are being used will work this way, because a lot of them will have like long reverbs and delays and everything will just sound muddy and flooded. And a lot of the times it just sounds like keys, or it sounds like it's being played out this long because the beats are being made with half speed on, which stretches it out, which is something I'm going to be talking about later in this tutorial, because doing this is going to make it more slow and make the sound more soft, as you'll hear in these types of beats. But what I'm trying to get to is that instead of doing that, I strongly recommend for when making your melodies that you use shorter notes like this, almost like plucks, because a lot of the times it's just short pluck sounds instead of like actual keys being played, but it sounds that way because they're putting Grossbeat on the beats, as I'm going to talk about later in this tutorial. Also, keep in mind when making your melodies that you're using a bass line instead of an 808 for the majority of these beats, so you don't want to go into like really low octaves or have too complex of a bass line in your melody. So in other words, don't be changing the root note like crazy in your melody. Just keep it simple, don't have too many chords or switch ups or complex arrangements. Also, you want to consider that you're going to have certain sounds being brought in and out of the beat, usually like old sine, like soft synth presets and bells with a lot of delays and reverb, and just overall a lot of stereo. But with that in mind, you need to remember to keep it simple and don't add too much rhythm to your melodies. What I'd say a general rule of thumb is try and stay like somewhat consistent with the distances between your notes, as that's what's going to give it like a weird rhythm that's going to throw the artist off. But yeah, that's basically it for melodies. There's nothing much you need to know. It's more about knowing what presets and where to find them rather than knowing like crazy chord progressions or tricks and stuff like that. So let's talk about the drums. So for the drums that he's using, he's really just using like traditional trap sounds like rack kick, young chop snare, metro sounds, hit one hi-hat, Lex Luger slap clap, as well as like Lex Luger 808s and open hats. So the thing to consider about the drums is that most of the time with the melodies, they're so simple and ambient that they're not going to have a lot of bounce to them. So you really want to carry the bounce with the drums. So that's why for most of these beats, you're almost always going to hear a kick, like a hi-hat, open hat, and like a snare instead of like a super soft clap being used. There's also a few drum sounds that he uses in almost every single beat that he makes, and this is one of them right here. It's this open hat preset. I'm going to link it in the kit in the description. So as for the open hats, one thing he tends to do a lot is he'll have an open hat like hitting in the beginning of the beat. And as you may see, the open hat that I use is pitched at different notes when it hits. And that's one thing you want to consider with these types of beats because he does it a lot. The general rule of thumb is that remember when you pitch something down, it stretches out. So consider that when you're trying to add like a bounce to it by switching the pitch. Also, this is something I see a lot of producers do that can just ruin the entire beat. With the exception of the hi-hats, don't be using like a ridiculous amount of notes when pitching instruments because you don't want to have it like be melodic whatsoever, because when you use too many notes, it can sound that way. As for the snare, you want to avoid using like the typical generic like clap pattern that you hear in like every single beat. Usually you just want to have like your snare fall along the lines of something like this. As for the hi-hats, Nav tends to use a lot of spaced out hats, meaning they won't be hitting on like every second step. He also uses like more long but slower hi-hat rolls. Hi-hat rolls basically that aren't like too fast or complex whatsoever, because you gotta remember that Nav is somewhat singing on these beats, and he's not rapping too fast, so like a quick aggressive hi-hat pattern wouldn't match the vibe of this beat. And generally for Nav beats, you want to avoid using a clap at times because, you know, you want things to punch through and be really bouncy because, again, we lose a lot of that with the melody. And clap sounds tend to be more soft, you know, and have less bounce and less sharp frequencies to them. So they're usually not the best fit for these types of beats. And last but not least, we have the kick. The kick is probably like the only thing with Nav beats that no matter what type of beat you're making, you're always going to want to have one. As for these types of beats, there's nothing really unique to the kick. He's just using like traditional trap patterns. There's nothing else to it. When you're using a sub bass especially, you're losing the bounce that comes with using an 808, and that's super valuable in a beat, so you want to compensate for that by having like a super punchy kick. Also, when you have a sub bass preset pick, you don't want to browse kicks individually without playing that sub bass sound. You want to play the sound while browsing for kicks because that's the only way you're truly going to find one that punches through. But yeah, apart from that, that's all you need to know for drums. So all the drums together now sounds like this. So let's talk about effects. So by far the most important effect for these type of beats is low pass filters. This is the effect plugin that Nav uses for his filters. It's called Fruity Love Filter. All of you on Fruity Loop should have it. The specific preset that he's using is called Simple Low Pass. And what you want to do when using it is just mess with the cut knob over here and just move it around till you get a sound that you want. It's really up to your ears at the end of the day. But yeah, you don't even need to necessarily use the Love Filter. You can just make your own low pass filter. But specifically, you want to like put it on like your bass, your melodic sounds, certain drum sounds, specifically stuff like hi-hats and kicks. Normally you don't have to, but it's really again up to you. It's kind of like what I said in the R&B tutorial where you want to give the artist space to add their own like reverb flooded vocals by leaving space in the high end, and it's also just a fundamental part to his sound. Personally, I like to put a love filter on the master and just automate it so it's only at like 5 or 10%. You just go by ear, but that's just because I'm lazy. If you really want to maximize in quality, you should just do this for each sound individually and do it as you see fit. The one benefit though of putting on the master is that a lot of the times they'll have automated filters that I use for transitions in the beat, and that's something that I highly recommend you experiment with. But yeah, at the end of the day, also don't force it. Again, the only thing I think you should really be filtering out every time is the sub bass. Everything else is going to be up to you. The next effect, or effects I should say, are reverbs, delays, and stereo separators. Really just anything that helps increase the stereo of your sounds. Personally, my favorite plugins for this are like Echo Boy and Valhalla Vintage Verb. And for stereo separation, I'll just use like the default knobs that are given in the mixer in FL Studio. You also might want to try putting like slight reverbs, delays, and stuff like hi-hats or open open hats, claps, or snares. As I keep repeating myself, it really depends on what you're going for, but personally I like to put like a slight reverb on the claps and the open hats for these types of beats. Also, I like to put like slight delays on my snares. The only thing I'd say is make sure that you're not having it mixed all the way. You want to only have it like sit slightly on these effects, so normally I'll have it like under the 50% range. So here are the drums for a beat I made. Without effects, they sound like this. And with the effects, they sound like this. Finally, the last effect is probably the one that uses the most, and it's Grossbeat, mainly the halftime effect. You can also use the halftime plugin if you want. It helps a lot with slowing the melody or beat down, and it gives it that vibe that you hear in most nav beats. Things I say you should try is that when you have like a simple melody, try only automating the Grossbeat to be only on like 50% of the melody, making it so it keeps the original melody, but then just also adds a few notes to make it sound more full. Here's an example of this with a melody I made. Here's what it sounds like without the Grossbeat automated. And here's what it sounds like with the Grossbeat. One thing that's super important to understand before you do this though, is that this is something that only really works if you're only using like a few notes, because if not, you're just gonna have like way too much overlap and complexity in your melody. Also, I'd recommend you try the reverse effect. He reverses a lot of his melodies. The thing about reversing though that people don't understand is that you never really know whether something will sound good when it's reversed. It's just something that you're supposed to quickly try, especially with these types of beats. You know, it can just completely change the melody and give it a completely different vibe. Finally, he'll also use it for transitions by automating it right before the beat is changing. Usually he'll just use like the tape stop preset. He might do the gated preset as you hear in Myself, or he might just use the halftime or mute the track entirely for the last beat or last bar before transitioning in the beat. For those who don't know how to do this, what you gotta do is you gotta come over here to the master, take this knob, right click it, and you'll see the option for create automation clip. And now when you go to the browser, you'll have this little automation here. And what you wanna do is right click it again and just kind of mess with these knobs and just kind of automate it till what sounds good. I'll play you a few examples in a beat that I made with these types of effects being used. But that's going to be it for effects as well as this tutorial. Let me know what you guys thought and what you want me to do in the next one. Also, I'm going to be doing a live stream probably like tomorrow, if not on the 31st, around like 2 to 2:30 Eastern Standard Time. That being said, don't start sending me beats now, because last time that happened, I got like 100 beats in an hour. So, you know, I'm going to tell you guys when you should probably send them, because everyone who showed up last time, I didn't really get to play all their beats because I was playing all of the ones that were sent beforehand first. So that being said, I'll give you guys a heads up on my Twitter or Instagram beforehand when you should start sending beats, and like confirming what date and what time I'm going to be live streaming. So again, make sure to follow my Instagram and Twitter at FinnaFinesse for that. And yeah, let me know what kind of video you want next. I think it's time I finally do White Armor, because I feel like I'm starting to get his sound now. So expect that next. And yeah, make sure to like, subscribe, and peace.